So the biblical stories, and starting with Adam and Eve, they present a different story. They present the emergence of self-consciousness in human beings as a cosmically cataclysmic event. And you could say, well, what do we have to do with the cosmos? And the answer to that is it depends on what you think consciousness has to do with the cosmos. And perhaps that's nothing, and perhaps it's everything. I'm going to go with everything because that's how it looks to me. Now, of course, anyone who wishes to is welcome to disagree. But if you believe that consciousness is a force of cosmic significance, which being itself is dependent on in any real sense, at least in any experiential sense, then it's not unreasonable to assume that radical restructurings of consciousness can worthily be granted some kind of cosmic or metaphysical significance. And even if it's not true from outside the human perspective, whatever that might be, it's bloody well true from within the human perspective, that's for sure. And so that's the initial event, in some sense, after the creation, is the cataclysmic fall. And then the entire rest of the Bible is an attempt to figure out what the hell to do about that. And everything in it is and so you could say, for example, in the earliest, in the Old Testament stories, what seems to happen is that the state of Israel is founded, and it rises and falls and rises and falls. And so there's this experimentation for centuries, or millennia even, with the idea that the way that you protect yourself against the tragic consequences of self-consciousness is by organizing yourself into a state. But then what happens is the state itself begins to reveal its pathologies. And as those pathologies mount, the state becomes unstable and collapses, and then it rises back up and becomes unstable and collapses, and then it rises back up. After it does this a number of times, this is primarily from Northrop Frye's interpretations, people start wondering if there's not something wrong with the idea that the state itself is the pathway, is the place of redemption, that there's something wrong with that idea. And so then I think on the heels of that comes the Christian revolution with its hypothesis that it's not the state that's the place of salvation, it's the individual psyche. And then there's an ethic that goes along with that too, which is quite interesting. So the ethic of redemption, after the state experiment fails, let's say, is that it's within the individual that redemption can be manifested, let's say. And even insofar as the state is concerned, because the state's proper functioning is dependent on the proper functioning of the individual, rather than the reverse, most fundamentally. And that the proper mode of individual being that's redemptive is truth. And truth is the antidote to the suffering that emerges with the fall of man in the story of Adam and Eve. And then that relates back to the chapters that we've already talked about, because there's this insistence in Genesis 1 that it's the word in the form of truth that generates order out of chaos. But even more importantly, and this is something like I said, I most clearly realized just doing these lectures for the last 3 weeks, is God continues to say, as he speaks order into being with truth, that the being he speaks into being is good. And so there's this insistence that the being that spoke into being through truth is good. And so there's a hint there. It's so interesting. There's a hint there right at the beginning of the story that the state of being that Adam and Eve inhabited before they fell, before they became conscious, insofar as they were made in the image of God and acting out the truth, that being itself was properly balanced. And it takes the entire Bible to rediscover that, which is a journey back to the beginning, right? And that's a classic theme. It's a classic mythological theme, that the wise person is the person who finds what they lost in childhood and regains it, right? I think that's a Jewish idea, that Zadok, if I remember correctly, who is a Messiah figure, is the person who finds what he lost in childhood and regains it. His idea of this return to the beginning, except that the return is you don't fall backwards into childhood and unconsciousness. You return voluntarily to the state of childhood, well awake, and then determined to participate through truth in the manifestation of proper being.